Well, the foundations are simple in a way. There are the foundations of the ideas and the values and the sort of perspective on the world, and they come out of classical Greece, particularly Homer and Greek tragedy, and they come out of the Jesus narratives. But classical Greece also gives birth to Western philosophy, to a large degree to mathematics, to architecture. Not entirely, there were the Egyptians, but certainly the classical form that comes with the Parthenon and buildings linked to that come out of classical Greece. Comedy, satire, the Athenians of 5th century BC satirised viciously their politicians. Very, very unusual in any other society ever in human history for that to be the case. So the whole tradition of criticism and reflection comes out of the classical Greeks. The tragic sense that thinking about the meaning of the horrible things that can happen to us humans and what happens to us at death, those sort of reflections in our tradition come from the Greeks. Very importantly, the emphasis on the individual. The Greeks were not tribal, unlike the Jews. The centre of attention and sort of belief and meaning in the Greek tradition, and Jesus continues this, by the way, is the individual, not the collective group, not the tribe. To a secondary degree, there's of course the Roman influence, and above all engineering, aqueducts, Roman law, and then we can go forward into the later periods. But essentially it's Athens and Jerusalem. Well, there are many. The most obvious ones today, if you are realistic historically, are the Industrial Revolution, which produced capitalism, which has produced basically the prosperity, the wealth, the comfort that we enjoy today. It's produced clean water, hygiene, modern medicine, the railways, the jumbo jet, codified law. That all was made possible by the Industrial Revolution and the capitalist system that followed. We'll never in the West have a Great Depression again because capitalism generates so much money today that we can provide a safety net. Probably equally important in the moving forward from the ancient world is democracy. The ancient Athenians had democracy, but they started it, but it had all sorts of problems. Plato was a major critic of it, for example, but parliamentary democracy as we know it today, sort of government of the people, by the people, for the people, is an extraordinary achievement. And I think with it has come, especially since the Second World War in the West, a sense of universal human rights, that all human beings are equal. This is in the teaching of Jesus, but hardly any societies that we know about have ever not had an us and them view of themselves versus others. The rest of the world almost exclusively wants to become like us. They want to become like us because they want the sort of lifestyles, democracy, prosperity that we have. But we're in the position of, someone who's happy. When you're happy, you don't think about happiness. It's only when you lose happiness you start to think about, what made you happy in those glorious times when you were happy. I think the same is largely true for the West. I think we particularly, and certainly in the culture at large, we particularly undervalue capitalism, which has made us so prosperous. Anyone with a realistic historical sense of what the pre-modern world was like, where in Europe there was endemic warfare, plague all the time, dirty water. If you got to the age of 40, you'd be covered in skin diseases, you'd have rotten teeth. Warfare was almost endemic too, starvation. No one in their right mind would want to go back to the pre-modern world. Now, the main reason that we are so different is capitalism. My advice would first of all travel. Go to Africa, go to the Middle East, Go to non-Western parts of the world, even go to Latin America, which is part Western, and just see the difference in societies which don't function efficiently, where there's squalor and starvation and endemic warfare and tribes hating each other, and where you can't rely on the milk being there or water being clean or food when you actually want it. So first, I'd say, to have a realistic sense of the achievements of the West, travel. Secondly, read Plato. Read Plato's Republic. Get you thinking about the sort of the big questions of the meaning of life and politics that are in there. Read Shakespeare, read Romeo and Juliet, read Hamlet, read Jane Austen's arguably the greatest of all novels, Pride and Prejudice, or even watch any of its film or television conversions, which are very popular today. Jane Austen's as popular as ever. And you'll see in her work how the serious study of character and motive and compatibility between humans and weaknesses and conflicts of motive can lead to happy relationships, unhappy relationships. In your reflections about who you are and what sort of life you would like to lead, all of these texts are profound guides which are there to help you. We humans need to understand, we become very insecure if we don't, who we are and why we're here. And we try to make sense of our lives, make sense of what happens to us when we die. We need to make sense of our societies and what's good and what's bad about them and how to make them better and how to avoid weaknesses. Now, with all of these questions, there is an immense tradition of reflection behind us, asking precisely, what's the nature of the self? I mean, Shakespeare's whole work in a way is all about the nature of the self and, who am I as a human being in all my strengths and weaknesses? Why do I get jealous? Why am I flattened with grief when tragedy strikes? Why do I enjoy clowning and buffoonery and mischief? In other words, to have a conception of yourself and your society, the greatest gift that can be given to you is the Western tradition. And without taking that gift and taking it very seriously, your life is going to be lesser. It's going to be diminished. It's going to be narrower. It's going to be more trapped in the present and, the anxieties of the brittle self. There's a critical distinction that needs to be made here between morals and meaning. Ethics, or what it is to be a good person, what it is to be a bad person, what's behaviour that we really disapprove of, and the police should intervene, and so should the courts. That's not really a problem in the world we live in. In realistic historical terms, we live in as peaceful, law-abiding, non-violent a society as you can find virtually anywhere. In other words, ethics, that thou shalt nots. I mean, there is a lot of talk about, what's happened to, morals. Our children are not well disciplined and blah, blah, blah. That's just not true. The problem in our world is the question of meaning, which is not in the sphere of morals, it's in the sphere of metaphysics. And it relates to the big questions that all human beings need answers to. All human beings in all societies in all times. And there are roughly three of them. One is, where do I come from? A sort of origins, genesis question. Second one, what should I do in order to make sense of my life? How to live my life? Why am I here? And the third one, what happens to me at death? For some reason or other, we humans, probably unlike animals, are very disturbed by the death, by the death question. Now, in a largely post-religious society like ours, I mean, hardly anyone's going to church anymore. I think it's 5% of Australians go regularly to church. People are not finding, or the vast majority of people are not finding answers to the origins, the meaning of life and death questions through Christian teaching or through any other religious teaching. They need to find it themselves. And so today we live in a sort of fly by the seat of your pants state where we're not anyone who's honest would have to say, I'm not really sure whether death is just death and I'm like a dead fish on the beach rotting and stinking, or whether there's a soul that goes off somewhere or wherever. You can't be categorically sure about that. Why am I here? Again, it's a question that's full of doubt. Now, in this context, the reflections of, say, a master of the Western tradition like Shakespeare, he's asking these questions all the time. Greek tragedy is asking these questions all the time. And they're doing it, Shakespeare's pretty non-religious. There's hardly any God, in spite of the time in which he wrote, there's hardly any God in the works of Shakespeare. They're not Christian works at all, they're much more secular than that. So he's asking questions, he's asking really the modern questions of, is there meaning? Is there any meaning? And in fact, the great founding figure in the modern world of someone who loses all sense of meaning in their life is Hamlet. I mean, Hamlet is completely flattened by the fact that life loses all sense. For him, he just wants to die, basically. So Shakespeare sort of inaugurates a long reflection. The great Gatsby's a part of this tradition too. Questioning. And again, as in the whole of the Western tradition, the emphasis on questioning, seeking, the assumption being there are higher truths, there are answers, but they are actually very difficult to get access to, and especially in the sphere of meaning. I think that's a very difficult and serious question. It's increasingly the case that the Jesus story, the story of the life of Jesus, is not known. And in fact, the only part of the Jesus story that's familiar widely now is the Nativity around Christmas carols and the manger and shepherds and all of that. But that's sort of religion for children. And in fact, I suspect if there wasn't this very powerful devotion to children today, the Christmas story might collapse too. Now, it's a very serious business if you take out the most important tragedy story in Western culture, the crucifixion, centering on Easter, which, we live in times which seem to think that Jesus is obsolete. It's a very serious business to let that go. That is not entirely let go because the Jesus story resonates in the sort of unconscious of the culture and of people. And I think it manifests in something that I'm writing a book on this, you might call a saviour syndrome. There's a sort of inner need to find someone who can lead, who can point. And a number of the most powerful of modern works of literature take up this sort of yearning for a saviour. You find it in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The Christ figure in that turns into a monster. You find it in Dostoevsky's Possessed novel. Actually, the Jesus figure in that turns into a monster. Perhaps better known currently, The Great Gatsby. Gatsby is a sort of Jesus figure for the narrator, Nick. Nick becomes very disappointed in Gatsby. It's almost sort of Jesus who fails. But what you can see in these works, the film Fight Club is a far more recent one, with Tyler Durden, the sort of Brad Pitt character in Fight Club, is a saviour figure. What you see in these very serious work, Waiting for Godot, probably the most important play of the 20th century, Godot, they're waiting for Godot, a person who's got God in his name, who's coming to save them. He probably doesn't exist, he's probably just a fantasy. But what we learn from these works is the yearning, the need for a Jesus figure is as strong as ever, although maybe just for the time being, we've lost contact with the Jesus figure himself. Well, the humanities certainly are. They've lost a sense of what they're doing. They've lost a sort of belief in beauty, goodness and truth, the sort of higher values that they need. Otherwise, people who teach in them will become, disenchanted, listless in what they're doing. So yes, in the humanities certainly, less so, and maybe not at all in the sciences, and in the professions it's a different question too. Well, I think what's to be done is what the Ramsay Centre initiative is trying to do: bring back the great works of the Western tradition. This may need a type of reformation. The Protestant Reformation in England came about when the Catholic Church was in increasingly hopeless state of disrepair, stagnation, decadence, whatever you want to call it. And there was a sort of rethinking of the same stories, rethinking of the same texts. But the crisis in the humanities and social sciences parts of the university is only going to be answered with whether some sort of renewed belief, and not having the university as a politically activist institution which believes in social reform rather than learning. The collapse of self-belief in humanities and social sciences has led to a politicising of the institutions as a sort of empty space. Therefore, how can we find something to do? We don't believe in the humanist traditions, teaching, learning, so we'll turn to political activism and social reform as the great aim and ambition of the university. This is disastrous. Politics does not belong in the university. Not any sort of politics. It's completely at odds with the pursuit of the serious pursuit of truth in any meaningful sense. So until the sort of politically activist phase comes to an end, it's only going to come to an end with some sort of new belief or a restoration of old belief.